Plant structures for successful reproduction. So plants are shaped a certain way for a certain purpose, and we're going to talk about that today as it pertains to how successful plants are for having offspring and passing their genetics down to future generations. So the first kind we're going to talk about are angiosperms. These are flowering plants. Any plant that has a flower is an angiosperm. These are plants that protect their seeds within the body of a fruit. These make up 3/4 of all plants, including trees, shrubs, herbs, grasses, water plants. All of these different plants are considered angiosperms. I'm sure if you look around your yard or your neighbor's yard or your local park, you'll see lots and lots of angiosperms. Pollination. So this is definitely a behavior that plants need to reproduce. So a lot of plants reproduce by having pollen fertilize the stamen of the plant, and then they produce seeds. So in this case, we're talking about wind pollination or insect pollination or animal transfer pollination. So they brush up against the pollen and then they do the work for the flower by transferring it to another flower, or the wind blows it from one flower to another. So flowers vary depending on the pollination mechanism, and we're going to talk about those specific pollination mechanisms. Pollination vectors. So these are all the different ways that plants can pollinate. So for instance, wind pollination. So these flowers tend to be dull and scentless. They have very few petals because they don't want the wind to get in the way. They don't need to be brightly colored to attract insects. They don't need to smell really good to attract insects. They just have to be able to release their pollen into the wind and have it carry it to the other plants or other parts of the plant. Bees and butterfly pollination. Now these plants are very brightly colored. A lot of times they have nectar or a scent that attracts the butterflies and bees. So they go to get the nectar from the plant, and meanwhile it kind of rubs its pollen all over the butterfly or bee gets the pollen all over their coat, and then they transfer it to another flower. So if you've ever noticed, butterflies tend to land on things like milkweed, or they'll land on, there's a thing called a butterfly bush that a lot of people will plant to attract butterflies, but they land on very brightly colored plants. Bird pollination, so when birds pollinate flowers, generally they are going after nectar, and they're usually bright colors, and they have tube-like flowers. They look like little trumpets if you look at the blooms. So for instance, if you think about hummingbirds, if you've ever seen a hummingbird feeder, they're generally very bright, usually red or yellow in color, so it attracts the hummingbirds, and it has little holes that they can stick their long beaks into to get the nectar. Moth pollination. So moths, a lot of times moths are active mostly at night. So they need to be able to see the plants, and so flowers that need moths often are white, so they can reflect as much light from the moon as possible, and they generally open at night. If you've never seen a moonflower, you should Google moonflower. There's some awesome pictures. Look at the videos, the time-lapse videos, and they'll show you how they close up during the day and then they open at night to attract their pollinators. Fly pollination. So flies like to help pollinate plants that smell horrible. So there are plants that smell like rotting flesh, and flies are attracted to that. So there are certain flowers that put out that smell to attract them so that the flies will pick up their pollen and carry it to other plants to pollinate. So once a plant is pollinated, they often, like I said, 3/4 of all plants are angiosperms, which means they produce their seeds or protect them in a fruit. And this picture is an example of that. That's a strawberry plant. So after fertilization, the petals and sepals fall off the flower. The sepals are the little green leaves underneath the flower. And so in this picture, you see the bloom, and then you see where the petals have fallen off, and then the next you see are the fruit starts to grow. The ovary, that's what we call it, ripens into a fruit, and the ovule develops into a seed. So the ovary is the fruit part we eat, and then the ovule are the little seeds. So once the fruit has formed, those seeds need to get somewhere so that they can grow in the ground. So there are a few different mechanisms or dispersal mechanisms, which means it's a fancy way to say how the seeds are moved, that allow the plants to colonize new areas and avoid shade of the parent plant. So it needs to get away from the parent plant so it has plenty of light and sun and space. So you've all probably seen these. Some people call them helicopters, some call them whirligigs, but these are wind dispersal seeds. So they have some kind of a flight mechanism, so that little tail helps them fly through the air, like parachutes, or sometimes they look like little wings. Also, if you think of dandelions, if you've ever made a wish on a dandelion that has a little white puffball, you are performing wind dispersal. So sometimes those seeds are within a fruit, and obviously the wind isn't going to blow an apple very far. So it uses a different mechanism to get away from its parent plant, which would be the apple tree. It has a fleshy fruit that attracts animals that want to eat that. So the animals eat it, and they walk along the forest floor or through the orchard, and then they poop somewhere, and then those seeds are basically in the soil and fertilized automatically by nature of the animal moving the seed for them. Also, if you've ever seen a cockleburr, those little things that stick to your shoelaces when you're out in the woods, those burrs are also seeds, and they'll stick to animals' coats. So like a fox running through the forest may get some of those burrs on its fur, and it's going to hang on to its fur for a little while, and eventually those burrs will drop off its fur, and that's its new home. So sometimes they use animals as a way to move. Gravity dispersal. This is for things with heavy nuts. So for instance, acorns in this picture you see here, walnuts, any kind of nuts often use gravity dispersal. They're heavy, they fall to the ground. Then there's water dispersal. So these are plants that live near water. This picture is of coconuts. They create floating fruits. So if you've ever seen a coconut, it floats. Put it in water, you'll notice it floats. Enough water. So coconuts are an example of a plant that grows along water. It falls into the water. The water obviously moves the coconut. It ends up in a place where it can open up and ripen and grow a new plant. So there are protection mechanisms too that plants use to protect their seeds until they are ready to disperse them, because they need time to grow. And if you've ever seen a pine cone, that is a key example of a plant protection mechanism. So, for instance, this says pine cones keep pine tree seeds safe and protect them from the freezing temperatures during the winter. To protect their seeds, pine cones can close their scales tightly, keeping out cold temperatures, winds, ice, and even animals that might eat their precious cargo. So I'm sure you guys have all seen pine cones that are closed up tight and pine cones that are open. So depending on when those were harvested, so if they're closed tightly, they were most likely harvested or found in winter, and the ones that are open were generally found in summer. Now you can force them to open by putting them in warm water, and there's several YouTube videos that are kind of interesting to watch to make it open and release its seeds. It tricks it into thinking it's warmer than it is. There are other ways that plants protect their seeds. So these trees, these are pole trees, and these are very unusual trees, but they are really tall, and they are meant to withstand giant forest fires. So as the underbrush burns off, these trees actually can withstand very high temperatures. And so they put resin, and it says a layer of resin and woody tissue sticks the cone scales together, so that these pine cones that hold these seeds for these trees are locked together with like a sticky resin, kind of like a syrup. And when it gets very hot, so like when the fires come through and burn off the underbrush, that will melt that sticky stuff inside the pine cones, and the pine cones will drop the seeds. The reason that they do that is because they need to be able to reach the soil to grow. And when there's a lot of weeds and brush and bushes and things like that, it can't reach the soil. So the trees hold on to those seeds until there's a forest fire, which burns off all that undergrowth. And when it burns off all that undergrowth, it leaves the soil bare, it releases its seed, they drop to the ground, and they are able to germinate in the soil. So these are really smart plants, really interesting plants. So today we've talked about several different ways that plants are able to help themselves reproduce successfully based on their structure. So like dandelions that use wind dispersal have those little puffballs, or brightly colored flowers that attract pollinators so they can get their pollen to other plants. So hopefully at the end of this presentation, you can start to look around your neighborhood, your yard, your local parks, and look at different plants and see if you can figure out a few structures that you think help them reproduce successfully.